This is Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield, a podcast that resources parents, families, and friends with tools to have important conversations about mental and emotional health. This podcast is brought to you by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. We are so glad that you are here on Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield. We are joined by another doctor, Dr. Stafford, the former president of Compassion International for 20 years.
That's right.
And we are so grateful to have you here. We're going to be talking about leadership and succession, kind of the end of leadership and how to pass on the baton.
How to finish well.
Yeah,
which is unheard of sometimes.
They say there's no success without succession.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here. You were mentioning before we started recording that you've been with Compassion for 42 years. Is that what you said?
43 years now. I joined Compassion when it was a little storefront ministry in Chicago, no bigger than a 7-Eleven store.
That's wild.
And it was out of Moody. Was it a Moody?
It was
No. Okay.
No, it was founded by a pastor who went over to Korea to minister to the troops and discovered the poverty especially among the children whose parents had been killed. So it was a small little ministry, and when we're going to talk about leadership and succession, it was a dinky little place. I didn't join it because it was great or big, but I could see the seeds of greatness in it, the heart, the spirit, the focus. We had only 6 parking spaces, I remember, when I joined. We only had 30 employees. And there were 6 parking spaces for the muckety-mucks. But the rest of us parked out in the neighborhood. This was Chicago.
Wow. Right.
And every 2 hours, we would get up and go move our cars so the neighborhood wouldn't hate Compassion.
Right.
What they didn't know is the car pulling out was Compassion, and the car pulling right in behind it was Compassion.
Well, and if you're watching and you're wondering why Mark and I are shaking our heads so vigorously, Wes, would you tell us a little bit about what Compassion is now in contrast to that beginning?
For those and most of our listeners probably know who Compassion is, but for those that don't,
When I started with them 42 years ago, nobody knew who we were. We were so small. But now I've had a front row seat to watching a remarkable ministry really come to life. In those days, we sponsored 25,000 children. That was after a 25-year of ministry. We got to 25,000. Today, it's 2 million.
Wow.
And about 4,000 employees around the world. Forbes just informed us that we're the 8th largest nonprofit organization in America.
Oh, wow.
So I have seen leadership from we all know each other's dogs and cats and kids to a rather large and pretty strategic and respected ministry.
Well, I know that on our time on coffee and breakfast and that kind of stuff, we've talked about how you were picked for succession, and from the former president. I'd love to hear, tell our listeners that story, because I think that's just an amazing story about how somebody saw something in you, back in your time in Haiti and picked you, whether you were ready or not, or realized it or not, to take his spot, even if it was was it 10 or 12 years before he left? 17
years.
Okay.
This man was a remarkable leader. I'll never be the leader that Wally Erickson was. So I was the 4th president.
Okay.
Wally was the 3rd president. And 17 years before his retirement and my first year in Compassion, stationed in Haiti, I was just crashing across the country in a Land Rover, working with villages and just loving it. And leadership was the furthest thing from my mind. Absolutely no aspiration for it. Didn't have a big enough ego to pursue it. And he saw something in that 27-year-old young man and came home and he said to his wife, I have found my successor. Now, he had the good sense not to tell me, right? Because I would have turned and run.
Right.
But what he did was very quietly orchestrate the path of my career. That's how I became Dr. Stafford. He knew that would be an essential part of it. He moved me from department to department to department until finally I was over it all while he was still there. At that point, he approached me to say, Wes, I think, I don't know if you've read the tea leaves or not, but I have been preparing you to possibly my successor. And it was something because I can't believe how naive I was. I was loving being Wally's right hand. I used to have a plaque on my wall that actually said, "Use me, O Lord, in your kingdom, especially in an advisory capacity." And then he put me in charge of marketing, the most quantifiable, visible thing in the whole place. And I remember thinking, I'm doomed. They're on to me now. I don't aspire to lead, and I don't know anything about leadership. But after all those years of very careful mentorship, Wally, we were elk hunting in Colorado, and we were sitting on this cliff, and he said, Wes, I'd like you to be willing to put your name in as my successor. And I remember saying, Wally, I have no interest in leadership from what I know and learned academically about leadership. I don't have the personality. I don't have the drive for that. And I remember telling him, Wally, if I could give you 10 years of my life, you lead Compassion for 10 more years, and I die 10 years earlier, I would do it in a minute. Mm-hmm. And I remember him, tears welled up on his, obviously we didn't get an elk. We're just talking our brains out on the mountainside. His eyes welled up and he says, Wes, that is very sweet, but you will see that you will be God's person for the next chapter. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, Wally, I love you and believe you, but I don't know how that is possible. But if you believe that strongly, then okay. Mm. As it turned out, he had so prepared the board and the whole organization. I don't know how naive I was to not know this, but he had prepared everybody. So there were no other candidates.
Right.
They didn't put out an executive search. The board simply, you and Wally brought it up, said, well, we've seen the writing on the wall all that time. Wes, are you willing to do that? Now, Compassion at that time had grown to 180,000 sponsored kids. Okay. So it had grown considerably, and I had been the director of development, helping it grow and such. So we were able to get away without a cloud of witnesses looking on saying, have you done due diligence? Have you done the executive search and all? 20 years later, when it came time for me to step out, the place had grown so big that we didn't have that luxury. We actually had such a cloud of witnesses, sponsors and staff around the world, that we had to do the whole due diligence process.
It's just amazing. I'm doing the math in my head, and I'm sure our listeners are too. So when you started, or when you started 25,000 sponsored kids, when you took over as president, 108,000 or so, and by the time you stepped down, I mean, 1.5 million, Jimmy's been on for how long now?
6 years.
Okay, so he's grown it as well. But just to see the blessing that God placed on you and on the organization for your humility and just your ability to lead well, that's amazing and humbling.
Nobody's more amazed or surprised than me. Yeah. I just had a front row seat to watching this happen. And people have often asked me, Wes, how do you account for this exponential growth of the organization? And my answer is, well, brilliant leadership. That's what I get. They're like, no, that can't be that. Right. So what is it? And what I say is, I believe that it proves that God honors those who honor him. Mm. And if you are doing something this close to his heart and this close to the center of his kingdom, he will bless the work of your hands. Mm.
That's just encouraging for us as a Mayfield Counseling Centers, just to hear being faithful and taking one step in front of the other. It's not easy work being on the front lines, but it's good work.
It is, absolutely. And you will, you're running a remarkable thing. You will experience this kind of growth. But what I know is you've got the foundation set. Mm. As you grow, there will be more zeros after every number.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you have to change. It doesn't mean you have to be a different person. So the roots, the foundation is in place.
Yes.
Growth happens.
Right.
It's a byproduct of doing everything else right.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I'm curious about what you talked about, who you were before the leadership role, and that you didn't feel like you had the right personality or the right drive. And I'm wondering if you think that maybe that was actually a benefit to you as a leader, because I've seen a lot of different leaders especially noted when they come to a point of succession, that power is what they're after. They want the authority, they want the say. And that, I think, sometimes comes with those personalities. We say like, oh, you're a leader because you want anything to do with power.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about how that may have impacted your leadership, especially in the time of succession?
Yeah. I would say the most dangerous thing about leadership is pride. When you start believing your own press, when you start really loving the applause.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why I didn't aspire to lead is I had spent 4 years in the Army, and I saw horrible leadership. I had to follow leaders' commands based on how many stripes were on their arm compared to how many were on my arm. And I remember for 4 years I had to follow unworthy leaders. But I should have been paying tuition the whole time I was in the Army, because what I was watching all the time saying, not that, not that, not that, not that. I'm not going to be like that. Then I went off and studied it academically at the master's level, and almost everything I was learning, I was rejecting.
Yeah.
I mean, it was crazy stuff. I mean, some of the textbooks literally were studying how to swim with the sharks, management techniques of Attila the Hun. What they don't teach you in Harvard Business School.
So you're saying Attila the Hun wouldn't have been a good leader for Compassion International?
Not in our context. Nor I actually think would I have been a great leader other than in the culture and the context and the purpose of Compassion. It's so aligned with who I was and what I felt needed to happen in the world that I argue this. You shouldn't go looking for leadership. I think leadership should find you. And the way it finds you is you care more than anyone else around, way beyond your job description, way beyond the cubicle in which you work. The bigger mission is your passion, with no regard to where you are in the structure of the organization. As a young guy, I said, this whole thing matters to me because God called me into this. So everything about it that isn't excellent needs to be excellent.
Yeah.
And silly me, I went all over the place trying to make the place better and better and better. Finally, I remember Wally Erickson, after I'd been in about 5 years, it was becoming pretty obvious that I was kind of a mover and a shaker, not for my own advancement, but for the cause. I remember him saying, "Hey, you with a mouth, come here." And that's when he made me his personal assistant.
Nice.
I sat in on the board meetings. I sat in meetings with major donors. And after those meetings were done, Wally would debrief them. Naive me, I didn't know what he was doing, but he was mentoring me, preparing me for that role.
So I think that was a good question, Trevor, and I think it leads into this conversation around why is succession so important? What is the purpose behind succession? We see, before we turned the microphones on, we were talking about, which Christian leader is going to renounce their faith today, or, it's just, you kind of, hold your breath as you watch the news or turn on social media and that kind of stuff. And it's become an epidemic, if I want to use that word, maybe correctly, or maybe I'm using it to be dramatic. But I think in some ways it's been an epidemic of leadership in our country, especially
a pandemic.
Pandemic, yeah, there we go.
Yep.
Of faith leaders and them not finishing well or getting caught in X, Y, and Z. So I think there's two questions there. I think the first one is just talk about the importance of succession. And why it was something that was, so with you and Jimmy, it was almost done a little bit backwards, right? You guys did this national search and you found somebody, but then you stayed on, for the last 6 years as a president emeritus to help with the succession, right? Am I right? Okay.
That's exactly. Well, the first few years were to help with succession because we got Jimmy from outside,
right,
which nobody would have believed we would do. So for the first few years, I was filling in history and philosophy and why on earth did we decide to do this or that? Once he was well in the saddle, then I was just a sounding board, bringing in Compassion's history and heritage. But one of the reasons why leaders fail and fall apart primarily is pride. I don't know that there's another one. I believe every Christian leader has a bullseye on their chest.
Oh, yeah.
And Satan knows that if he can destroy the life of a Christian leader, there is a lot of collateral damage, a lot of other people injured. So it shouldn't come as a huge surprise that that happens. But what it mandates of a Christian leader is they walk very humbly and very close to the Lord. I think I told you I grew up in an African village. And when I first heard that Satan goes about like a roaring lion, this wasn't just some distant story to me. I knew lions. I had hunted them with a sling. I know how they hunt. And so I remember thinking immediately, well, I know what that means. That means that the lion climbs up on an anthill, a termite hill, and he studies the herd of gazelle in front of him. He doesn't just go dashing in there, biting and slashing. He studies it. He's got all kinds of time. And I maintain Satan does the same. He will actually allow a Christian leader huge success, waiting for the biggest moment for the return on investment of the destruction. Right. So what a lion does is he looks for the young. One of the reasons why I fight for children. He looks for the young. He looks for the elderly. He looks for the injured. But when it comes to leaders, he looks for leaders who are distracted and lagging behind, not leading at all. He looks for leaders who have wandered off to the side, assuming, well, everybody will come my way. And he looks for leaders who are strong and out in front, assuming, of course, they're all behind me. And they get themselves marginalized and distanced from their people and from their cause, and they become vulnerable to satanic attack. So it is a serious thing for a Christian leader to walk very close with their Lord and humbly with our Lord. When you see an organization grow, as Compassion did from this little storefront to this massive big thing, the biggest temptation is to take more than your share of credit. Right. Now, you should take more than your share of blame, but exactly. The worst thing a leader can do is take more than their share of credit. Right. But you have got to always have your eye down the road. I used to say to the staff at Compassion, nobody in this organization is qualified for their job 5 years from now. If you don't stretch and grow, there's going to be a wave that crashes over your head and you're going to get left behind. I am not qualified for my job 5 years from now. So staff development, bringing up everybody, it's the job of the leader to keep the focus of what the ministry is about. It's the job of the leader to be the most passionate, the last to give up hope in the hardships, the first to see the silver lining coming out behind the cloud, because you've got a cloud of witnesses who are watching you and your leadership. So the journey is not just grow the organization as big as it can be and as good as it can be, but to prepare the place for the future. Right. And it's a no-brainer if your ministry as Compassion is to children in poverty, then you are always asking, what's 10 years down the road? What's 20 years down the road? And so it's no surprise, actually, now that I think of it, that Wally was already thinking successor when he had 17 years to go.
Yes. On that, there's a phrase that has really struck me since early college, and it was a pastor saying that a leader who does not form their identity in obscurity will fall as soon as they get on stage. And what I'm hearing from you is this idea that one of the responsibilities of leadership is to prepare in obscurity, maybe not as obscure as they might think, in your case, the next leader, the next person who is going to be qualified one day for that job 10 years from now. And I think that's an interesting way to think about leadership, especially since a lot of leadership is focused on the now and maybe the past, a little bit of the future, but not about when will I give up this leadership? When will I no longer be in charge? Yeah,
and again, that goes to pride. The word leadership. I'm told, never did count myself. I'm told it only appears in Scripture 6 times. Every other reference to the concept is servant. Moses, my servant. Paul, a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so when you get all wrapped up with management of Attila the Hun, that is not a servant heart. And that's usually where it falls apart. And without a servant heart, you're not worried about the future of the organization beyond your time. So it behooves the leader, I maintain, it behooves the leader of the organization to be the first one thinking about succession. And I have learned the succession at Compassion went really, really well. It's been 6 years now, and Jimmy Miato is strong in the saddle.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
I've learned that the secret to succession is you want to leave just before they want you to leave.
Right.
You don't want to outlive your value to the organization. So years before I announced to the board, I'm going to retire at roughly retirement age, 65 or so. And it's time for us to start looking for my successor. And they were like, Wes, we're hitting on all cylinders. The place has grown by leaps and bounds. Why would you do that? And I said, because I want it to stay that way.
Yes.
And so I took the initiative to start the succession process 3 years before I was ready to step out. First thing I did was try to get everyone to buy in, to not argue with me that I needed to be gone, but to buy in that the next leader was going to lead a very large organization. Yeah. And so what I did is I did a survey of our international staff. I did a survey of my executive leadership team and a survey of the board of directors. Identical questions, letting them speak into what are we looking for. I reminded them that compassion is going to be a massive, huge thing, say 15 years from now, when this successor might be doing succession themselves. And so what would an organization of that size, say 4 million, 5 million children, what will that require? So think beyond now and think bigger than now. And I asked them, what academic background are we looking for? What gender, what age, what skill set, what attitude. And the amazing thing, we're talking leadership out of 25 countries, an international global leadership, and execs who had been around, some of them for 20 years. And what we were looking for when I did the compilation was almost identical.
That's
there
awesome.
was no one group that was wildly different. Essentially, and this was unfortunate, essentially what they all said is, we want you 15 years younger. I'm like, okay,
thanks, guys.
That's not an option.
Yeah.
So with that, I took all of that data and I wrote up the 21 criterion we were looking for. Here's what I heard about age. Here's what I heard about ethnicity. Here's what I heard about education and all. And I wrote, this is what we're looking for. So the whole organization began looking around at each other. Who shows that? That's what we handed to the executive search group. Nice. I had 6 people that I had been mentoring that were all viable options for the board to consider. But during these last 4 years of my leadership, the place doubled in size. So the minute I put that survey, we went from 750,000 sponsored children to 1,500,000 children. Wow. And suddenly this was a far bigger place. And the board, I think, wisely said, you don't have anybody really prepared for this size place, much less where it's going. We need at least somebody with CEO experience. Right. And that's when they said, so that's going to have to be outside the organization. And can you help us with that at all? And by God's grace, I gave them one name that I had been really good friends with for 20 years. And it was the only name I gave them. And they approached Jimmy Miato, and it was unanimous, quickly seen that God had been preparing him over at Willow Creek Association for this. So it was awesome. It was quite a process. Let me tell you very quickly, Jimmy and I met the same year, 1993, that I became president, and he became the president of Willow Creek's Association. Okay. And we were at the Broadmoor right here in Colorado Springs at a little gathering for young CEOs. And we happened to get roomed together over there. The only night I've ever spent in that 5-star hotel. But so I said to him, Jimmy, so what are you leading? And he talked about the importance of leadership development in the church and why that was important. And he went on with enormous passion, as a young CEO would. He turned to me and he said, so tell me what compassion does. Now we're about 2:00 in the morning. He says, tell me what compassion does. And I said, well, Jimmy, almost the same thing, except we start when they're in the womb, or certainly when they're finally going to school. We are preparing leaders for the church around the world. And our hearts burned within us that God, and so we talked till 4:00 in the morning.
I love it.
And then we prayed, and then we promised each other, you know what? We're going to be friends as long as God lets us lead. So for 20 years, we touched base regularly. When he had a big dilemma, I would bounce the ideas off him. When I did, he would too.
That's great.
And when it came time, I knew his heart. I had watched him grow an organization exponentially.
Yeah.
And it was a no-brainer.
That's great.
I handed it off to a dear, dear friend.
I love that, and I love the story of just God's faithfulness. And I'm sure you've probably had many times just to sit and watch, take a step and turn around and look at the history of God orchestrating certain things along certain ways. He knew. I mean, how cool is it to think that in 1993 he knew that you were talking to your successor?
I know.
That gives me chills just to think about God's faithfulness of, and really, like I've heard you say a couple times, because of the mission, because of the care for these children, it was much bigger than you and anything else. And so seeing God's faithfulness, I'm sure it's just got to bring a smile to your face.
It does. One of my greatest joys is to watch compassion thriving under Jimmy's leadership. Now, people often ask us, because this, success and succession are back to back in the dictionary, but they are worlds apart in the world. Sure. And it usually doesn't work well. So people are often coming to Jimmy and me and saying, would you talk about succession? Jimmy, would you talk about incoming leader? Wes, would you talk about outgoing leader? And we've pondered it a bit to think they wanted us to write a book or something. And we've pondered and said, there are certain principles, but there has to be the guidance of the Holy Spirit. There has to be something bigger than just our minds and our passion. So Jimmy and Leanne, his wife, the year before I talked to them, went on a family weekend retreat while their Willow Creek Association was just thriving. And his wife, Leanne, felt or heard God say, I need you to be open to a change. And when she told Jimmy that the next morning, he was like, no. We have built this thing. It's on all cylinders. No, how could God say that? But all right, we'll listen.
Be open. Yeah.
So when the board asked me if I would approach the one and only external candidate, Jimmy's daughter was graduating from the Air Force Academy right here in Colorado Springs. So he was in town, came to my office. They sat down at my little conference table. And I turned to him when the time was right. And I said this, Jimmy, I wonder if you would be willing to be open to possibly being a candidate for my successor. And I looked at them, both of them, their eyes welled up with tears. And they said, well, since you put it that way, of course, we'd be willing to be open to that. And so who could have orchestrated that I actually used the same word that God had used to awaken them to a new possible chapter?
Well, and sometimes, and I'll shout out to my wife, sometimes it's our wives that are the ones that are listening to the Lord a little bit closer than we are. And
matter of fact, usually,
yeah. Because time and time again, God has been working on my wife's heart going, hey, this is coming. And I'm like, okay. And then, year, 2 years, 6 months.
God is amazing with women. I never really hired a key leader at Compassion. I can tell it now, I can show my cards, without them having a meal with me and Donna.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was done, as we were driving away, I would turn to Donna and say, well, what'd you see? What'd you feel? And sometimes she would say, man, they're amazing. Sometimes she would say, there's just something not right there. Yeah. I never hired a leader at Compassion that didn't have the endorsement of my wife after a 1-hour meal.
It's wise. Very wise.
Well, Dr. Stafford, it's been great having you, and I think Mark and I would be remiss not to have you back for another episode to talk about maybe leadership from some different perspectives as well. But I'm grateful for you being here on this episode, and I know that for me, and I'm assuming for Mark as well, this has been really encouraging and really insightful into not only our own personal lives, but also as we look at the company Mayfield Counseling Centers and our dreams for the future. And I hope that for our audience, it's been helpful as well to glean some information in the richness of your experience. So we'll have you back. Thank you for being here today.
I'm honored to be here. Love what you guys are doing. And it's a fascinating topic, leadership and the succession.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep.